Okay, welcome back, y'all. It's today is Wednesday, but this recording is meant to be used in conjunction with next Monday, which is the 20th of September. So this is Monday's class, the 20th of September. I believe that's correct because I think today is the 15th, and then that would make Monday 5 days hence from now. So yes, a couple of administrative announcements before we actually embark upon a discussion of, well, the remnants of what remains of our discussion of the French Revolution, of which there's really not much to actually get into. So I'm going to finish that, and then I'm actually going to spend some time talking about the book today. And I know I alluded to that last time, but I think it's imperative for us to begin to really delve into the book, at least to some extent, because if we don't get into it at this point, I'm afraid that we won't have time to actually do justice to it throughout the rest of the duration of the term. So I think it's incumbent upon us to at least look at that and examine some of the more important, critical, and salient issues that arise in the course of the author's thesis, which what I'm going to do today when I get around to doing it. So as I said, I got a couple of announcements, but what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through the introduction to the book, okay? I think it's the introduction. Maybe it's actually chapter one. I want to make sure I'm telling you guys accurately. So I guess, yeah, it is the introduction. So there's the preface, which is a bit tedious, and it's cumbersome because it is inclusive of probably about 25 pages in total. I don't know if it's that many, but there's a big preface to this book, okay? And it doesn't really say a whole lot. There's a lot there, but there's not much substance. And then he gets into the introduction, which sort of lays out the general parameters of the author's argument, which is interesting. And I think you can glean a lot from the preface of this book. There's a lot to understand, and there's a lot to really interpret there. And so what I'm going to do for you guys, so that you don't actually have to necessarily read the preface. And I'm not saying you ought not read it. I'm just saying that I don't think you necessarily have to. So those are two different stipulations. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief synopsis, sort of my interpretation, my understanding of what the author's primary points are in the context of the preface and the introduction, rather, because this is going to foreshadow much of what he's going to say later on in the book. What I will not say, therefore, is that you don't necessarily have to read this. I mean, I think that if you don't get much out of what it is I'm going to intend to do today, if that is not particularly edifying for you, and you find that perhaps it would behoove you to actually delve into this yourself, then by all means, please do so. So what I'm going to say as far as the introduction, which is only about 20 pages long, it took me a little bit over an hour to read all that. Shouldn't take you very long. If you think that it would be advantageous for your purposes so that you understand it in greater depth than what I represent it as being, then by all means do so. Please read it, right? But I'm saying that this is supplementary reading, okay? This is supplemental. It's not necessary. It's not mandatory. It's not obligatory. It is I'm not even going to say it's recommended, okay? I think some of you can get away just fine without having read much of this introduction, if any of it at all. So that's what I'm going to do with respect to the book. Before I get into that, though, a couple of announcements which I think are really incumbent upon me at this particular juncture to make. First of all, as I said, this is going to be the lecture recording associated with Monday, the 20th of September. Now, if my calculations are correct, that means that the following Wednesday is going to be the 27th of September. And I think I suggested sometime previously that we are going to intend on taking our first exam around the end of the month, around the end of this month, in that it's necessary, it's almost essential for us to do so, because otherwise we won't have adequate time to take two subsequent tests. Because if you think about the structure of this class, you think about the curriculum, you think about the fact that we only have, I think, 16 or 17 weeks in this term, so that's about 3.5 months, let's call it. And so we've already taken, we're already coming up to about the 1 month mark, okay? And what that means is that if we are planning on taking our exams at a consistent sort of regular interval, then we only have approximately 2 months subsequent to this point in time. assuming that the time between the second exam and the final exam is going to be more substantial than the time between the first exam and the second exam, which I think it ought to be, because the final exam is going to be weighted more heavily pursuant to what I represented in the very first day of class, i.e. the further we get into this class, the more, presumably, the more acclimated you will be to the process of actually assimilating yourself to the material that is expressed in the course of these lectures, i.e., or ergo, you will, at least ostensibly, be that much more conversant with that material, that much more fluent with the nuance of the information that I convey, and that much more prepared and ready to actually engage with the questions on the exams. So thusly, what I try to do is I try to apportion and ascribe greater weight to the subsequent exams than to the initial exam, because you may be, you're right out of the gate, you're not familiar with the way in which I ask questions. Perhaps many of you haven't actually been exposed to essay exams in the context of college examinations. I don't know. I can't necessarily assume that you have. And so for those reasons, I really do think that I'm trying to construct things as favorably as I can towards your interests, so as to ensure that we maximize the potential for success, for academic success, for all of you in this class. So that's why the subsequent tests are going to be weighted more heavily than the ones that are earlier on. Hence, the final is going to be weighted most heavily, and therefore I'm going to need the most time in anticipation of that which is going to be on the final. And this is just me going through and sort of planning and plotting. It doesn't necessarily involve you guys, but it involves you to the extent that what it entails is that we are going to plan on taking our first exam right around the 27th of September. Now, I say right around because, as you know, this class doesn't necessarily, or this format doesn't necessarily lend itself to a vis-a-vis me actually observing you. I have no way of actually doing that. I mean, I guess we could actually come together for a Zoom session, but I'm not going to do that because that would just be completely defeating the purpose of doing these YouTube videos, because I know many of you were motivated to do this precisely because you understood the implication was that you didn't actually have to physically take a test in front of me or in a room and have time constraints and have constraints placed upon what you actually could use in terms of materials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stipulate that the first exam be submitted to me. I'm trying to think of when the clock is going to begin to tick on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys probably about a week to 10 days to work on this, right? Which I think is more than enough time. And the questions on the first exam are going to pertain almost exclusively to the materials associated with the French Revolution, and then sort of the introductory materials that I covered before we actually delved into the substance of that, which is to say that all the stuff up until about this particular point in this class. Now, what I'm going to do for you, I guess the next lecture video is going to be in association with Wednesday, the 22nd of September. That's right. I think that's right. What that means is that that will be the lecture video prior to the actual test. Now, since we're not actually physically taking the test at a particular place and at a particular time, that means that I guess we have a decision that we have to make. And the decision is this. Do we say that because we are doing this via YouTube, and because we should assume that because I'm offering you guys between a week and 10 days to actually get the test done, that you can find the time outside of the strictures of this particular class to actually apportion to the taking of that test, that therefore we ought not to conclude that it is necessary for us to forego a lecture session out of consideration for the fact that you guys might not actually have the time otherwise to take the test. Which is to say, just another way of putting that, because that's a rather contrived way of representing it, which is to say that should we not actually have a lecture video associated with one of the days in the week, this is the week of the 27th and the 29th of September, should we say that, well, let's not actually have one of those lecture videos. Let's not impose upon Jeff the requirement of actually standing here in front of this recording device in this basement or wherever else and making a video for an hour, 53 minutes, or however long it actually happens to be. Should we say that we're not going to do that, not just out of consideration for my time and my interests, but more so to the point out of consideration for your time and your interests? Now, the way I look at this, I mean, there's two ways of looking at this. I say, since this is actually a YouTube-based class now, and a YouTube class is very much, I think, in many ways analogous to an online class, because you don't actually have to be at a particular place at a particular time. And in an online class, what I typically do, in fact, what I almost always do, what I consistently do, is I give the students generally, I don't assign them any work, and I don't assign them any lecture materials to listen to, and I don't assign them any other responsibilities for a particular week that is usually the week that they are expected to actually complete a particular exam. Which is to say that if we do that which I do for my online classes, and it seems to me that, again, based on the structure and based on the mode and the modality of instruction here, that this is more consistent with the methodology of an online class than it is consistent with the actual form of a physical class, then it would follow, therefore, that we ought to do much of what I typically do for an online class, which is to say that I give them the entire week without any encumbrances associated with classwork or homework or lectures or listening to me or watching me or anything of that sort, just so that they can exclusively devote themselves and their time to the taking of the test. Now, I'm leaning in that direction, okay? That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going to release any lecture video for that particular week. It probably just means that I'll release one as opposed to two, okay? And the other consideration that seems to be probative in all this is that perhaps there are some of you, and I don't know if this is true, but I think I have to assume that there are some of you who don't actually have any free time outside of that narrow window that you had apportioned putatively in anticipation of actually being in this physical class throughout the course of the semester, which is to say that the only free time you guys actually have to dedicate yourself towards things that relate to History 102 during the week is Monday morning and Wednesday morning from 9 a.m. to 10:53. And if that's all the time you have, then I can't very well say that, well, I'm going to expect you to listen to these lectures during this week that also happens to coincide with the week of the exam, and I'm going to impose upon you the mandatory requirement of listening to those lectures, which are going to be an hour and 53 minutes in length or thereabouts, because even though I keep on saying I'm going to cut these short, I actually end up not doing that. And in addition to that, actually expecting you to also undertake to complete that exam. Now that seems to me to be completely unfair to those of you who actually don't have the time beyond the 9 a.m. to 10:53 time block and every Monday and Wednesday. And if you don't have that time, and if your schedule is so hectic and so demanding, you have so many other ancillary responsibilities in addition to this class that you just can't find the time, and that therefore you're responsible for listening to lectures during that week and taking the exam in addition to that, well, that wouldn't allow you to apportion sufficient time to actually engage with the exam, to take it with the requisite seriousness with which it is due, and therefore that would be, to my mind, unfair to you, and I'm not going to impose upon you that which I find to be unfair and offensive to my personal sensibilities as they relate to equity. So therefore, what I'm going to do for the week of the 27th, based on all of these assessments and analysis that I just did there, I think it does seem most equitable to just go ahead and say we'll have one lecture that week, and then it'll be a Monday or Wednesday, I don't know, and then you can use the time that you would otherwise dedicate towards purposes of actually listening to whatever it is I'm saying on a given day. You would use that time in furtherance of taking that exam. Okay, so let's do that, right? And the reason I'm setting this up the way that I am, and the reason I'm going through and actually elucidating this as extensively as I am, is because I want you to understand that there is a rationale as to why I'm making this decision. There is a reason, okay? There's a rational calculus, there's a reasonable consideration that is motivating me to make the decision that I did with respect to that particular week, which again is 2 weeks from I think that's about 2 weeks from today. Well, that's about 2 weeks from 2 days ago. Anyways, I'm going to talk more about the test next time, which will be the lecture associated with next Wednesday, the 22nd of September. And I'm just going to give you guys some advice and some pointers. But remember, this is going to be essentially a take-home test, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that you ought to go to Wikipedia or you ought to go to other resources that I wouldn't recommend you go to. You should primarily rely, in fact, almost exclusively rely upon the notes that you derive from, that are produced from, incidental to listening to me talk to you either in the classroom or via these YouTube videos. That's what you ought ought to be doing. Okay, if you're using other resources, i.e. the book. Now, if I ask a question that actually pertains to the substance of the book, then by all means, the book is in play, the book is fair game. Go to the book, avail yourself of the book as much as you see fit, right? But if I'm talking about things that don't actually relate to what the author is discussing, then by all means, don't actually go to the book, because it's not going to be particularly instructive. Now, I'll talk more about this stuff later on. So that was the announcements that I had to make. Now, I think what I'm going to try to do here today is I'm going to sort of bifurcate today's class into two portions. Part one is going to be me just closing escrow on the final elements of the French Revolution, which I really do think I need to do justice to, because we haven't actually talked about the Reign of Terror, which is absolutely intriguing as it is terrifying. So I need to get into that. And then what I'm going to spend probably a lot more time on, is actually going into the book. And as I said, giving you guys my understanding and interpretation of the introduction to the book. Not the preface, the introduction. Okay, the introduction is much more substantively driven. So as I said, not Niall over there is talking about a lot of things that he's actually going to explore in greater detail later on in subsequent chapters. So I'm going to give you guys my spin, my pitch, my interpretation of what he's saying. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with me. All it means is that you listen to me and you obviously try to assimilate yourself to what it is I'm saying, and the significance, the import, and the value of that educationally. All right, so we left off last time talking about, I think, we were talking about the implications of the trial of Louis XVI, and I was going through and I was saying, well, there were various possibilities with respect to what the tribunal, which essentially was a legislative committee, right? It was the combined houses of Congress, the equivalent of the combined houses of Congress, came together. The National Assembly, that was duly elected by the French people, came together to evaluate, to adjudicate the guilt, the moral and legal culpability of Louis XVI as it related to the indictment. The charges against him, which were high treason and other associated charges, right? Conspiracy to commit treason. And treason is just to essentially betray your oath of loyalty to the state. And I talked about the possible defenses that could have been utilized by an advocate on behalf of Louis XVI. So remember, go through and be able to articulate what those defenses actually consisted in. And then I said, well, there's a bunch of arguments that if you were the prosecutor on behalf of the tribunal, you could have made these arguments, which would have, I think, imputed a good degree of legal culpability to Louis XVI. Now, one of the things that I don't know if I actually got to this, but I know I got to sort of what would conceivably have been the consequences of the various options which the tribunal had to them with respects to the adjudication of guilt and the sentence, actually. What were the various sentences? I said they could have let him go free, but I said that seemed to me to undermine the integrity and the veracity and the legitimacy of the entire process, because if you're trying to make the case that this king is a diabolical, tyrannical, absolute monarch, and he's abusing his power, and he's ruling in a very ad hoc and indiscriminate manner, and he's imposing all manner of human rights abuses on the people, then to let him go seems to suggest or allow the imputation that his crimes weren't really that egregious. What he did wasn't really that opprobrious. The odium which you tried to ascribe to him as the monarch wasn't really actually legitimate, because if it had been, then you would have held him to a higher standard of accountability, and you would have assigned a greater punishment to him as a manner that was symmetrical to the egregiousness of his conduct, because that's the way that they say the punishment ought to meet the crime, right? The punishment matches the crime, or something to that effect, right? Now, if the trial had just went ahead and absolved him essentially, or relegated him to a sentence which wasn't very punitive, which wasn't very harsh, well, then most people would have drawn the inference that, well, obviously they weren't taking it very serious. Either the tribunal wasn't taking it very seriously, or it was the case that they decided that the king wasn't really that guilty, or he was guilty of things that didn't really warrant a very harsh punishment. And therefore, what's the point of undertaking this trial in the first place? In fact, the revolution itself, the French Revolution, was in many ways predicated on the presupposition that the king was very bad, that monarchy was antithetical to the common interests and the common sensibilities, the democratic sensibilities of free-loving libertarian people, French people everywhere, okay? And if you say that we're going to render a judgment which doesn't actually assign a great great deal of punishment to this king, whom we find to be so odious and whom we find to be a degenerate, tyrannical reprobate. Well, if you have to judge him by the consequences of the trial. And so I think the more severe the penalty that is going to be assigned to him, then the inference is, well, the more egregious his crimes actually were, as they tangibly affected and impacted the French people and had consequences for the French nation. So that's the argument against just letting the guy go, letting him go back home and letting him hang out or whatever, right? Just releasing him altogether, and not actually punishing him. Now, there was another possibility, right? They could have imprisoned him. Okay, and I think the argument against imprisonment is to say, well, if we sentence him at all, if he's guilty, then he ought to be guilty of very serious crimes, right? You can't really say, well, he's only a little bit guilty, okay, right? Because again, that in many ways, I think that has the effect of rendering illegitimate the entire edifice of the tribunal. It undermines the integrity of the process to say, well, we had this entire revolution essentially to overthrow the monarch, right, i.e. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, his wife, the queen, right? But then we get to the guilt phase and we say, well, we're just going to sentence you to house arrest, or we're going to put you in prison for a little while. That doesn't really comport with the magnitude of the undertaking, the social ramifications. I mean, the cataclysmic social significance of a revolution which overthrew a monarchy which had existed for many, many hundreds of years. So I think that was a concern in the back of the minds of many of the people who were making the decision as to what the actual sentence was going to be for Louis XVI. And then secondly, if you just sentence him to house arrest, he's going to be obviously offended by that, right? That is an insult to his royal integrity. That is an insult to the fact that he was actually formerly the king, and to his mind he still is. And it also allows for the opportunity of him being rescued, him escaping, and him potentially being restored as the monarch, as the head of state, and then exacting his retribution upon the people who were responsible for putting him in prison in the first place. So I think that's one of the motivational factors that enters into the decisional calculus, which eventually yields the judgment. The verdict, which actually happened to be death. Okay, so it seems to me to be logical to come to the conclusion that death was actually necessary under the circumstances, because this is a guy who you can't afford to let him get away. Okay, and you really can't afford to let him just get a light sentence, right, or no sentence. You can't afford that, because that just looks very, very bad. And as I say, it really de-authenticates the entire process. It makes it seem as though this is just a pretense. It's a farce. Okay, and so for you to actually assign a very serious punishment to this guy, and be it death, or be it you're going to have to serve in the dungeons of the Chateau d'If, by the way. That's where Edmond Dantes, for those of you who are familiar with the story of the Count of Monte Cristo, yes, the guy who produces the butter, Count of Monte Cristo. There was there's a scene in that movie where this guy is betrayed by his best friend, and he's sent to this, essentially the Alcatraz of France at this time, a little bit after this time, actually, about 15 years after this time, and he goes to the Alcatraz of France, and it's this lonely, isolated prison, and it's on this little island off the coast of Corsica, I think, which is another little island off the coast of northwestern Italy, and it's a horrible, deplorable place, and he's sleeping on this disgusting cot, and it's absolutely horrendous. Well, that's the kind of place that they probably would have sentenced Louis XVI to, if in fact they had sentenced him at all to a particular period of time in prison. Now, if he was subjected to that, as I suggest, I think he would have construed that to be a terrible indignation, an affront to his royal honor and his royal dignity, and that would inspire in him the desire for retribution and vengeance upon the people who were responsible for sentencing him in the first place. So in a way, it goes back to the Machiavellian principle that I think I alluded to probably back in class a couple of weeks ago, which is to say that if you have an enemy, and this is a mortal enemy, and you hate him and you know he hates you, then what you have to do is you have to absolutely, completely destroy and annihilate him when you have the opportunity. You don't allow him any reprieve. Don't allow him to get up, right? You kick him when he's down, you go for the nuts, you absolutely annihilate this guy. You kick him in the head, you got the brass knuckles, you got the baton, whatever you use, right? You fight cheap, you fight dirty, but you absolutely destroy him, because if you don't, he's going to come back at you with hatred in his heart and a malignancy, and he is going to exact his retribution on you. And I think that's exactly what these guys were thinking who were sitting in judgment of Louis XVI, because no doubt some of them had actually read Machiavelli. These were smart guys. Many of them were lawyers. Many of them were very clever, very shrewd lawyers. But anyways, very edified individuals. Not all of them, but many of them were. Okay, so I think that death is the only, probably the most reasonable outcome. The death sentence is the most reasonable under the circumstances. It has a finality to it. And in a certain sort of sense, it's also, in many ways, I think it's also consonant with the grievances that are being expressed by the French revolutionaries themselves. If you say that this king is a figurehead who represents all the deplorable depredations that have been inflicted upon the people of France, that have cumulatively been inflicted upon us over the course of the last 700 years, right? If he is the figurehead, he is the one who has to be held accountable, because there's nobody else, as I suggested before. There's what? There's him and Marie Antoinette. Well, the king is the king, right? It is his royal prerogative to rule pursuant to how he sees fit. Now, you can't say, I think it's a rather tedious legal argument to say that he is vicariously responsible in a legal sense for all the depredations that were committed by his ancestors and his precursors and all the people who preceded him as the monarch of France. You can't say that he is vicariously liable in a legal sense for all those terrible things that would have been done to the people before he actually became king. But you also cannot say that we can absolve him completely from all those past grievances that the people cumulatively and collectively have against the monarchy. Because there's this idea, there's this concept in law, international law in particular, and it's called command responsibility. And it means that if you are a commanding general, if you're a 4-star general or a 3-star, well, it doesn't matter how many stars you got. If you are a commanding general and you're responsible for an army, or a corps, or a division, or a brigade, or a large military unit, which has thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of soldiers in it. Any of your subordinates who go out there and commit war crimes or crimes against humanity, even though they did so without your express authorization, and even though they did so without your knowing that they did so, you can be held vicariously liable for them having actually committed those atrocities in a court of law under international principles of law. And that, to my mind, is actually very much analogous to the principles which animated the death sentence, which was eventually imposed upon Louis XVI. And so, from a legal standpoint, from a legal and a sort of moral, philosophical standpoint, I actually think you can justify the death sentence. You can justify it because it was expedient, and expediency dictates necessity. That which is expedient, that which is pragmatic, that often is that which is necessary. Because if you don't kill the guy, there's the possibility for him coming back and exacting his retribution and killing us all, right? That was the concern that the National Assembly had. Secondly, it's a matter of making the point that the severity of the sentence anticipates the magnitude of the crimes, or is in many ways symmetrical to, or consonant with, or not incongruous to the magnitude of the crimes that are being charged in the indictment against Louis XVI. Which is to say that he's being charged with very serious crimes. I mean, not him necessarily personally. You could say the crimes against that he actually was guilty of were personal crimes. He wasn't out there lobbing people's heads off. He wasn't out there torturing people. He wasn't out there just executing people capriciously without any due process of law. No, but he represented a system which had previously done those things, but he personally, okay? So you talk about sort of vicarious legal culpability, and then you talk about personal legal culpability and personal legal responsibility. What did Louis XVI do that was actually really, really bad? And that was really, really odious as far as the people of France were concerned, particularly the sans-culottes, the poor, the downtrodden, those who had been abused, whose rights had been abused by the aristocracy and particularly the monarchy for a very, very long time. What did they find to be so egregious about how this monarch had comported himself? Well, because he had actually, well, I already said all this. He pledged loyalty to the Constitution, and then he repudiated that pledge. He violated his vows, and he tried to sneak off in the middle of the night and go off to Austria and recruit an army and come back and kick ass, right? Now, if you do that, that shows bad faith, number one. It shows you're completely disingenuous, number two. And it shows that you're essentially a traitor, number three, right? And traitors deserve to have their heads cut off, okay? I truly believe that, right? You betray me, I'm going to come and find you with a guillotine, all right? No, I'm not. Okay, and that's a moot point because none of you are actually in a position to actually betray me, because I don't think there's anything you can actually do. You don't have the information to betray me. You can't blackmail me, I don't think anyways. I don't know, I'm being recorded, so maybe you can, but I don't think I've said, so that's why I'm very wary about what I say on YouTube versus what I say in the classroom. You'll notice that I say more things, I'm more liberal in my conversation in the classroom than I am here on YouTube. So it seems to me that death was perhaps the most logical sentence. It was the most logical. Does that necessarily make it fair? Well, one of the points that I'm going to make in conjunction with what we're about to talk about, which is the Reign of Terror. This is a phase of the French Revolution whereby there is a great deal of, I'm sorry guys, I'm getting distracted. I think there's there's some kind of construction work going on outside here, but it doesn't matter because well, we're talking about revolutionary activities, and it's hard to distract from that. So what the question is, with respect to the sentencing of Louis XVI and the death sentence that was imposed upon Louis XVI, is this any better executing this guy? And by the way, not just execute, not just lethal injection with phenobarbital or the electric chair, which I think is actually pretty brutal, but they imposed upon him a form of death, a form of the death penalty, which to the sensibilities of most, I think, average Americans, and certainly probably to the sensibilities of most average Frenchmen at the time, was really quite atrocious, right? It was not necessarily the way that you want to be executed, right? It was a way that in many ways literally dehumanized you. It debased you because it actually dehumanized you in the sense that when you were being guillotined, all right, I wish I had a little miniature guillotine to do a little illustration here, but I don't. So I'm just going to have to give you guys as apt a description as this process as I possibly can. A guillotine is like this large wooden frame. It's got like it kind of looks like a Smith machine. You guys ever go to the gym? It's got these two like rails that run parallel to each other, and then it's got like a crossbar on the top, and then there's this blade that comes down that's affixed to the top bar. It's attached to the top bar, and the blade just drops down, and it severs the head. Okay, severs the head, severs the spinal cord, all the nerves, right? Instantaneous. It's ostensibly instantaneous, right? Now there have been anachronistic reports historically of once the person's head actually is severed, decapitated from the torso, that their eyes are looking around and they're frowning because they're sad because they know that their head is no longer attached to their body and they're kind of upset, right? And so that would suggest that there's still some measure, some degree of consciousness and awareness, and that they are actually cognizant of what's actually transpiring around them, and the fact that they have their head cut off. And so the consciousness, we always have this notion that consciousness is sort of situated somewhere in the mind. It's kind of behind the eyes, right? And you say, who am I, or where are you? Where is your perspective? Well, the perspective comes from what I can perceive, and what I perceive is associated with my head. It's not what I perceive is associated with this this area of my body or down here in my foot. No, it's up here. And so if the center of your perceptual capabilities is still possessed of the ability to actually understand and apprehend its surroundings, despite the fact that your head has been severed from your body, that's a pretty horrifying and mortifying prospect to contemplate. Now, I don't know if that actually was, there's been no insinuation that this was the case with Louis XVI, but nevertheless, rather atrocious, rather barbaric way to die. It's not barbaric necessarily for the experience, the subjective experience of actually being guillotined, having your head cut off, so long as it's instantaneous, right? If it's instantaneous, it's immediate. It's just like Hitler, right? The bullet through the brain, it's simultaneous with the cyanide capsule under the teeth, right? And I think if you're going to go, that's the way to do it, because that's sort of double redundancy, right? You got a backup plan in case the bullet misses goes into the optic nerve as opposed to goes in the neural cortex, and you're just left there and you're drooling all over yourself because you don't really, you're still awake, you're still alive, but you're not really fully aware. That would be the worst case scenario. Well, I think the guillotine sort of obviates that, but it's dehumanizing, it's debasing, and it's particularly debasing for somebody who had formerly been a monarch, right? Who formerly sat in a gilded throne, in a gilded throne room, right? The throne room of Louis XVI would have looked like the penthouse that Donald Trump lives in Trump Towers in New York City. I don't know how many of you guys have actually been up there. I like to hang with the DJT often. We go up there. We do lines of cocaine together. No, I'm just kidding. But I've seen pictures of the interior of the very lavish and ostentatious penthouse that he resides in, and he's got a gilded, gold-plated toilet up in there, right? Now, you know that you made it in this life. You know you're living the American dream when you can take a crap on a gold-plated toilet, right? That's pretty amazing, okay? Now, I don't know if Louis XVI had a gold-plated toilet, but he had a gold-plated throne, and he had a throne room. He had all kinds of attendants, and he had a huge entourage, bigger than Kanye West's and Kim Kardashian's combined. So that's a lot of entourage, a lot of followers running around behind him. And to go from that to having your head cut off in a public square with thousands of poor peasants watching that, right? It's disgraceful. It is a tremendous indignation. It is an indignation and an affront to your personhood. And I think that that's exactly what it was meant to be. Because think of it this way. He's not necessarily being sentenced as the king. He's already been dispossessed and divested of his royal prerogatives. He's no longer the king when he's there on trial. He's Citizen Louis, okay? And if he were still a king, then it would be in some ways incongruous or indecorous, shall we say, unbecoming of the executioners and indeed of the tribunal itself to impose upon Louis such an ignominious end, to have his head cut off as a king. You can't do that to a king because he's ordained by God, right? He's ordained by God. Okay, you can't, because that would be an offense, that would be an affront to God, and Jesus Christ would be upset with you. And if Christ gets upset with you, you know where you're going. You're going to hell, son. All right? And so I think that they had to dispossess him of his the trappings of the royal power before they actually put him on trial, because if in fact that trial was going to eventuate into a death sentence, you couldn't very well have any sort of royal or monarchical connotation associated with the person of Louis XVI. He couldn't be Louis XVI anymore. He could just be Louis, right? Just Lou. Okay, my dad's name is actually Louis. I don't know if he's named after St. Louis, not this Louis, not this guy who got his head cut off. But my dad he's Uncle Lou, right? We just had this stupid wedding that I attended, and everybody was coming up to my dad and hugging him. He's a very gregarious, sort of personable guy, and everybody's hugging him. Oh, hey, Uncle Lou, right? Well, I think that's kind of what they referred to Louis as. He was just Lou, right? He was Uncle. He was just Lou, okay? Now, onto this business of the reign of terror. So just understand, if I ask you a question on this forthcoming exam that's going to be coming up in about 2 weeks from, well, almost 2 weeks from today, 2 weeks from 2 days ago, if I ask you a question that concerns itself with the execution of Louis, okay, there is a lot that you can say in terms of the reasons as to why the National Assembly, this legislative assembly, felt as though it was incumbent upon them to ensure that they passed down the death sentence, and they did it in a way that was consistent with the guillotine, right? It's not just what they did, it's how they did it, okay? In fact, I think how they did it actually says more about their decision than the mere fact that they sentenced him to death, right? Think about that, hopefully assimilate that, and if you don't, let me know. I guess there's two sides to every story. I'm sorry, guys, I keep on holding this this document here in anticipation of talking about the reign of terror, but I keep getting distracted because there's still more to talk about. What about is there a downside to executing the former king in this rather depraved and ignominious and debasing manner? Is there a downside to that? I submit to you that there is. And if you haven't anticipated it already, think about it this way. If you are aspiring to go out in a blaze of glory, and you want to achieve street credibility with whatever lingering followers you still may have. If you want to enhance your credibility, if you want to enhance your moral standing with vis-a-vis those people who actually might still look up to you and admire you, then the best way to do that, I think the most efficient and expedient way of doing that, is to go out like a martyr, okay? To go out like a martyr. I mean, you think about the Christian martyrs, the Catholic martyrs. You think about St. Joan of Arc, right? You think about certain martyrs who were actually literally burned at the stake, okay, because they were willing to die for their beliefs. They had the courage of their convictions, so much so that it motivated them to actually say, yes, I still believe in God. No, I will not renounce Christ, even when faced with imminent destruction, even when faced with a destruction which they knew was going to be harrowing and terrifying and absolutely painful. They still did not renounce or recant. Now, that's pretty extraordinary, because it gives us all something to look up to and aspire to emulate in certain ways. I'm not saying be fanatical. I'm not saying be a fundamentalist. Fanaticism and fundamentalism are not necessarily good things, especially when they go hand in hand, especially in conjunction with religion. But nevertheless, you have to admire those who are willing to die for their beliefs, right? Even look, I mean, I don't admire much about ISIS, the Islamic State. There's not much to admire, right? I don't like the cutting of heads off of people using machetes. I don't like the filming it for YouTube purposes. I don't like the stoning of adulterers and the throwing off of rooftops of blasphemers and the sordid killing of anybody who commits apostasy against the Islamic religion. But nevertheless, they have excellent taste in vehicles, because they're all driving Toyota Hiluxes and Tundras, and occasionally a few Sequoias for the commanding officers, those guys who are really high rank, such as myself, because that's what I drive. Second of all, you have to say that, hey, they know how to go out. They don't go out like punks, okay? They go out like jihadist aspiring martyrs is what they go out like. Now, I think what you can say about ISIS, what you can say about Mahmoud and Mohammed and Mobashar driving around in their shitty old Hilux that's all rusted out and it's got a big 50 cal in the back of it, right? Just before the Predator drone blows those guys up without them even knowing what's coming at them, right? Before they achieve their martyrdom status, right? Well, you could say that in certain ways the extent to which that resonates with fans of, followers of, adherents to fundamentalist, not Sharia, Salafi Islam, which is the version of Islam which is permissive of a literal interpretation of the jihad phrases in the Quran, which says that jihad is not just metaphorical, but it's actually literal. Go out there and find your Hilux and your AK-47 and go and reap some destruction and chaos on the infidels, because they're out there committing all kinds of licentious, debauched, promiscuous sex, and we as ISIS are the purifiers of the world on behalf of Allah and Muhammad. Well, if you're a Salafi Islamist, well, then you look at that and you say, hell's yeah. Yeah, go blow up that busload of Israeli children. Yeah, go and drive your Hilux into the market and just shoot as many people as you possibly can. Yeah, go and rent that U-Haul double axle big 2.5-ton truck and mount the curb and run over people at the the local festival in downtown Royal Oak, or the stupid NASCAR for dogs that they have up there in Calumet with your Toyota Hilux or whatever you're doing, right? Now that seems to me to be in many ways precisely symmetrical with what relationship Louis XVI had in the act of being killed in that particularly ignominious fashion. An ignominious way of dying is just a very shameful and humiliating and debasing, dehumanizing manner of death. It seems to me that in many ways actually enhanced his street cred. Okay, I'm not going to say that he necessarily died as a martyr, because it's not really for us to make sort of subjective value assessments as to whether or not there was martyrdom achieved, because we don't have all the information. But I will say this. If you try to put yourself in the mindset of the monarchists, the people who still supported the idea that the king should be the rightful ruler of France, and if the king goes out like a man, okay, he doesn't go out like a punk, he doesn't go out like a bitch, he goes out like a man, all right? And he went out like a man, fully asserting his prerogative to come back and to be the ruler of that place, right? Because we know he tried to abscond off to with his wife and with his entourage off to Austria to go and recruit an army to come back and reestablish himself as the absolute monarch of France. Now, if he died in furtherance of that aspiration, the monarchists can say, you know what, Louis XVI is a man who is worth fighting for. He represents an ideal. And in the words of V for Vendetta, which by the way actually makes reference to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, talks about the destruction of Parliament incidental to the English Civil War. So in many ways, it's actually reminiscent and evocative of the kinds of themes and topics that we're talking about. In fact, we actually ended up watching a movie in this class. We may very well watch V for Vendetta, even though it has very little to do with Western civilization. It's a great movie just for watching it. But there's a quote in that movie, and the quote goes something like this. It says, people shouldn't fear their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. Okay, actually, that's not the quote, but that's another great quote. And I think that actually came from Voltaire, another guy who I'm going to be throwing quotes around from later on today. But what the hell am I talking about? Oh yeah, martyrdom, right? Martyrdom. So martyrdom can be a good thing because oh, that's right. The quote is, you may be able to kill me because I'm just a man, but I represent an idea, and ideas don't die. Ideas are immortal. Right, I bastardized that quote. He says it much more eloquently and much more charismatically than I could ever render it. But that's the notion. I think that in many ways you could ascribe that connotation to the death, the guillotining of Louis XVI, in the sense that imputes to him the status of martyr, and that in many ways invigorates the spirit of many of his followers, because they say to themselves, well, this was our king and he was willing to die for his convictions, that he was actually truly the rightful ruler of France. Then we would be repudiating or denying him his glory. We would be renouncing him if we ourselves failed to live up to the illustrious example that he himself provided by dying for his own convictions and his own beliefs. We ought to emulate that. We ought to aspire to follow that. So in certain ways, I think you got to be careful about this, right? Executing the guy, yes, it may be expedient. Yes, it may be safe for your future interests, right? In terms of not allowing him to escape and get an army and recruit them and come back and kill you, right? And yes, it may be necessary because as the figurehead, as the representative member of the monarchy who has to stand accountable for all the crimes that have been committed against the people collectively and cumulatively in the aggregate over the course of many centuries, you bear that vicarious responsibility. There's nobody else who actually can stand in place of you. For all those reasons, it's a good idea, but it certainly has the capacity to invigorate and to animate and inspire a great deal of monarchist sentiment, not just in the people who were previously monarchists, but in people who perhaps commiserated with the king and said that we, the revolutionaries, the radicals, Robespierre, the Reign of Terror, the Committee on Public Safety, the National Assembly, all these other institutions associated with the radicalization of the revolution, they had gone too far. They had gone too far and they committed a terrible sacrilege. And who's to say that they hadn't? Because only
God can sit in judgment as to whether or not this was sacrilegious. The killing of a former king, is he still a king? I don't know, and that's another question that they have to reconcile themselves with. And I don't know if it lends itself to a ready and intelligible answer. I just don't know that. If you can't answer that, well, then you don't know. He might still actually be a king in the eyes of God. And then what you're doing is an offense to the dignity of God. It is an offense to the honor of the Lord, and the honor that was bestowed upon the king, and his right that was bestowed upon the king, which derived from a dove all from on high. And if you do that, then that must be a mortal sin, and you're all going to hell for that. So I think that there are many actual, there's two sides to this argument, okay? And I'm trying to encapsulate as succinctly and as comprehensively as I possibly can these two competing oppositional antagonistic propositions, which I hope you guys have assimilated to the point where you can actually make this argument yourselves on a piece of paper when I ask you the question in the course of the exam, which is coming up in 2 weeks. Okay. Let's talk about me sitting my ass down and taking let's talk about me taking a break here, because this is, I'll tell you guys what, I'm going to adjust this camera right here because I don't know if you can see me very well. I know you need to see me as much as you can, because otherwise you may lose interest in this. Let's talk about this thing called the Reign of Terror, all right? What was this Reign of Terror? Well, I alluded to it last time by just saying that there were these poor people. Well, they were just poor people, right? They were poor people who were the poorest of the poor, and these were the people who really these are the people who fed the flames of revolutionary fervor, if you want to put it as eloquently as that. These are the people who are really outraged by the historical depredations of the monarchy, because these are the people who suffered most disproportionately relative to the rest of France. Because as I said, you had different classes, right? You had the aristocracy, you had the clergy, you had everybody else, but within everybody else, within that third class, within that the third estate, as the Estates General would denominate it, right? Within that third estate, you had different sort of stratifications, right? You had socioeconomic stratification. At the very, very bottom, you had these guys, the Walmart shoppers, right? That's okay. I shop at Walmart. All the stuff that you see me wearing right now came from Walmart, actually, except for this Puma hat, which my ex-girlfriend, on-again, off-again girlfriend / ex-girlfriend got me. Probably not from Walmart, because I don't think they sell Puma there. But I'm a Walmart man, right? So I would be amongst the sans culottes. Of course, you'd say, well, Jeff, you're sitting there in the basement of a multi-million-dollar mansion in Bloomfield Hills, which is like the Boardwalk or Park Place of Metro Detroit. How can you possibly be a sans culotte? I lived in a trailer park for 2 years, actually, when I was attending graduate school down in Ypsilanti. All right, so that gives me street cred with the sans culottes, with the guys that don't have pants back there in France. It says that, well, that's a good way of putting it, right? They were trailer trash, right? They were the trailer trash of France. And why was the trailer trash of France so absolutely enraged and outraged? And why was their outrage something that fueled the mechanisms which gave rise to bloodletting and gave rise to internecine conflict in the context of France? Conflict, war between Frenchmen, the monarchists and the revolutionaries and the radicals and the reactionaries and all the other factions you had in France at the time. Why was it the fervor, right? This desire that arose from the poorest of the poor, the trailer trash, the Walmart shoppers. What's so integral about understanding their grievances? Well, it just so happens that most of these poor people tended to reside in the cities, okay? Paris especially was overflowing with these very, very poor people who were very, very despondent and very, very downtrodden. And if you think about where the center of power is in France, the center of power in France is the state, the national capital, which happens to be Paris, which at this time also happened to be Paris. It was sort of divided between Paris and Versailles, because Versailles was where the king's palace was, but after the king is gone, there's no more monarchy. It's not an absolute monarchy anymore, so we don't have to have the vestigial trappings of monarchy. So therefore, we can just unilaterally associate the government with Paris, right? Now, the National Assembly is the government, and the National Assembly is in Paris, and Paris is teeming with these very, very poor people who are extremely discontented. Okay, and therefore it is in many ways incumbent upon the most vociferous and rhetorically gifted and outspoken and charismatic members of the National Assembly to literally pander to the sensibilities of these common people, because they are surrounded by them, right? And they perhaps fear the retribution that these common people will take if in fact they don't pander to them and accommodate and appease them and make all sorts of conciliatory gestures that are really aimed at invigorating the interests of the poorest of the poor, and particularly particularly addressing their grievances. So what do the poor people want? They want vengeance for the suffering and the depredations that they have had to endure over the course of many centuries at the behest of the aristocrats, the church, and the monarchy. They want retribution. They want revenge. They want some kind of accountability. And the members, the most active and the most outspoken and the most rhetorically gifted members of the National Assembly, including this guy Robespierre, who we keep referencing, these are the guys who went out there and actually literally invoked the name of the common people and then instrumented policies which had the effect of essentially dispossessing people of their fundamental legal protections against unwarranted prosecutions. Now, what ends up happening is that this period of the Reign of Terror, as I said, is essentially a byproduct of the fact that you have a lot of conspiratorial thinking. Okay, one of the things that I think I referenced last time was that imagine the social media, imagine the profusion of all the various idiosyncratic conspiracy theories that are out there on social media, and we just respond by saying, well, I'm going to tune out this Facebook group, or I'm going to join that Facebook group, or I'm going to follow this person on Instagram because I like their theories no matter how unvalidated they may be, right? I'm going to follow that person. Well, those are the implications living in the age of social media. What were the implications for conspiracy theories when living in the age of the 1790s in France, in post-revolutionary France, or early revolutionary France? The implications were literally matters of life and death. And if there was the insinuation that you were somebody who may be conspiring with the nobles or the aristocrats, or the clergy faction, the Catholic Church faction, or if you were perhaps somebody who had relation, you were related to people who lived in Austria or people who lived in Germany, right? The mere imputation that you could conceivably have the desire, the personal subjective desire, to engage in acts of treason against the state was sufficient to actually initiate a prosecution, an indictment, a prosecution, and a conviction against you on the basis of mere hearsay, conjecture, and speculative rumor, right? Now that seems to be to fly directly in the face of due process of law. Or habeas corpus, right? The Great Writ comes all the way down from the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was the Great Charter, as it was called, but it set the precedent. And the Magna Carta was endorsed by King John, the same John from the story of Robin Hood, back in the early 1200s. Okay, so the idea that ordinary common people, not just aristocrats, but ordinary common people, had some de minimis protections under the rule of law, that you couldn't just completely arbitrarily infringe upon their life, property, or well-being and livelihood without some legal procedure to determine the extent to which they were actually guilty of the thing that you're actually trying to indict them for. There was always this due process of law, even under the monarchy, okay? Even under the kings, right? There was always the due process of law. Now, the law worked in a way that gave undue deference and favorable consideration and a great deal of bias in favor of the aristocrats and the clergy, and obviously anybody who was related to the king. But that's not to say that if you weren't a member of those constituent groups that you didn't have any protections at all. No, you had some protections. You had some protections, just not very many protections. But now, the irony in all this, of course, is that the revolution ostensibly happened in furtherance of enhancing the civil liberties and the civil rights and the human rights that were inalienable and inextricably associated with each and every one of us as a human being. Now, what the French Revolution failed to do was to really codify those rights in the way that the American Revolution did. Now, one of the things that I've been consistently trying to do is drawing the contrast between the American Revolution on one hand and why it was good and why it was salutary in its effects, its historical and moral and legislative and constitutional effects, and then why the French Revolution was in many ways not in the least bit comparable to the American Revolution, because it was bloodthirsty and because it wasn't governed by philosophical and moral precedents, and it resulted in sort of a degeneration, which was actually worse than which came before. Now, as I said, I think the problem with the French Revolution is that you have literally mob rule. Mob rule, well, I guess metaphorically mob rule. But I suppose you could say literally in the sense that the people who are controlling the National Assembly, which, by the way, is responsible for promulgating laws, the laws of the land, because now we don't have a monarch anymore, so we just have a constitutional republic, and the constitutional republic is governed by this National Assembly, which is dominated, by the way, by just a few demagogic, very rhetorically brilliant public speakers, such as this guy Maximilien Robespierre. and they can go out there and they can dominate the agenda because they're very articulate, they're very persuasive, they're very compelling in their capacity to actually induce followers to believe in whatever it is they're advocating for, and they dominate the agenda, and they actually create committees for themselves. One of these committees, it's like a committee, it's like a subcommittee of the Congress. I don't know how many of you guys, if any of you guys, ever watch C-SPAN. It's probably one of the most boring channels in the history of cable programming. In fact, I don't even think it's cable; it's basic cable, right? So you probably get it, even up there and off yonder where you all live up there off the grid in the UP. There's no place that I've ever lived. As I said, I've lived in a lot of places, even trailer parks, and even in trailer parks they get C-SPAN. But if you watch C-SPAN, essentially what it does, I mean, it does many things. One of the things that they do is they actually show the proceedings of the Congress. So they show what's going on in the Senate chamber, and then they show what's going on in the House of Representatives, and you see these people get up, and then you see the process of the filibuster, and you see the process of the debate, right, the exchange between the various representatives of the various members of the Senate as to the propositions that they're making, the amendments, and whatever they're doing, the legislation that they're about to promulgate. You get to have a more nuanced appreciation, understanding for the inner workings of the legislative branch of our government, which is there's a value in and of this itself for that, right? But if you watch that, you'll find out that the way the Congress works is that the most powerful people in Congress sit on subcommittees that are constituent. They're constituent subdivisions of the Congress as a whole, right? So if you sit on the subcommittee for appropriations, for instance, right, you're responsible for determining what money that the government has goes to various projects, goes to infrastructure, goes to defense budget, goes to education, etc. You decide which departments actually are allocated what percentage of the budget. That's a very important position. Now, likewise, in a similar way, I think the analogy is actually rather symmetrical with respect to the National Assembly. The National Assembly was just this large body of delegates that came together that were elected by the people. They sat in this large legislative hall, right? These are the guys that judged the legal responsibility of King Louis XVI. But a constituent subdivision of that legislative assembly, the National Assembly, consisted of these guys called the Committee for Public Safety, okay? The Committee for Public Safety. And the Committee for Public Safety was, the chairman of the Committee for Public Safety was this guy, Maximilian Robespierre. Now, the reason he was able to get himself in that very high-ranking position, whereby he had a lot of authority, whereby he had a lot of discretion in terms of how he actually implemented policies, was because he was a very, very good and very, very persuasive orator. He was very successful at appealing to the sensibilities of the common people. And if he could do that, he knew that he could induce the people to support him, and that if he didn't get well, not only would he induce the people to support him, but by virtue of inducing the people to support him, he knew that the legislatures, right, the other members of the National Assembly would also therefore support him, because after all, this is an elected body. This is a body that's accountable to the common people, right? Well, it's accountable to all people, not just the common people, right? But if it is an elected body, then you have to say that the members are there at the behest of the people. And if Robespierre is very good at invigorating the sensibilities or animating, inflaming the passions of the common people and molding them in such a way so that they actually acquiesce to whatever it is he's proposing, well, and if it follows, if the other members of the National Assembly are there at the pleasure of the common people, then obviously those National Assembly members are going to go along with whatever Robespierre is advocating, because they know that otherwise that they're accountable to the common people. And the common people support Robespierre because he's allowed to get up there and talk and make these great and masterful speeches and induce the people to follow him to wherever it is he wants to go. And the fellow members of the National Assembly are afraid to undermine the authority of Robespierre because they fear the consequences, the political ramifications, being held accountable to the people, right? Because they won't be up for re-election, or indeed maybe the people will take justice in their own hands and come into the National Assembly and drag him onto the streets and lynch him, just like they did to the guy in the Bastille, all right? So this, to my mind, is in many ways precisely antithetical to our American democratic libertarian sensibilities. In fact, this is one of the things that Madison, let me think, was it Madison? It was Madison. It was Madison, and it was some other guys, and I think it was Hamilton also, that they foreshadowed that they anticipated this. Okay, they were concerned about this. They were concerned about mob rule, so much so that they actually relied upon a philosophical work by the name of a guy by the name of a Frenchman by the name of de Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville. And de Tocqueville wrote actually about this very concern that he had, and he referred to it as the tyranny of the majority. Okay, the tyranny of the majority. Now, obviously, our Constitution takes into consideration the possibility that a majority might get together, whether it's these common people living in the streets of Paris, or whether it's just the common people living in the streets of New York. It doesn't matter, right? The concern was, of course, that you cannot infringe upon the inviolable rights of your fellow citizens, and those rights are vested upon them becoming not just citizens, but they have human rights as well. There are civil liberties. There are liberties and privileges associated with citizenship, and then there are natural human rights. Okay, and the French didn't really go that far so as to codify those rights, and so therefore you had all kinds of arbitrary infringements upon the rights of the individuals incidental to this process known as the Reign of Terror. That was really motivated and inspired by Robespierre, who was just acquiring more and more power unto himself. Because think about it this way: he's the leader of this Committee for Public Security, and the Committee for Public Security was, as the name implies, responsible for ensuring that safety and internal security was maintained within the context of this new French Republic, right? And so they were responsible for the police and the detectives and the military and all the other forms of governmental force that could be used to actually enforce the law. And that's a very important position to have. But the more, if you're Robespierre, if you're his fellow members of the Committee on Public Safety, if you are those guys, the best thing you can conceivably do for yourself, anyways, for your own interest, if you're interested in acquiring more power and just amassing as much power and authority and control under yourselves as possible, the best thing you can do is to inspire fear and terror in the hearts and the minds of the common citizens of France. Because the more fearful and the more terrified they are, the more likely they are going to defer to your arguments in furtherance of enhancing security measures, abrogating or completely obviating civil liberties in the interest of maintaining a higher level of national security. And we see this is the axiomatic and exorable debate throughout the course of history. This echoes and reverberates throughout history. And in fact, it's a debate that we in our own lifetimes, I think, well, in some of our lifetimes anyways, have seen here in the United States. I mean, think about the Patriot Act. For those of you guys who remember this, after 9/11, we just had the 20th anniversary of 9/11 about 4 or 5 days ago. After 9/11, there was a legislative act that was passed through Congress that was advocated by the Bush administration, that was known as the Patriot Act. And this created the TSA, the guys who we all love at the airport, who they get out the rubber gloves and they do the full body cavity search, and it's extremely unpleasant and it's humiliating, but they do that pursuant to the mandate of the Patriot Act. And what it did is it didn't fully suspend habeas corpus. It didn't give the courts the right to just go out there and arbitrarily infringe upon the civil liberties of common citizens of the United States. But what it did is it made it much easier to prosecute terrorists. Okay, and so if you were not a United States citizen, you didn't really have the kind of protections that due process afforded you. And so it was much easier to get convictions and much easier to prosecute. And some people, especially the ACLU and a lot of liberals who understand the law, they said, well, this is an abomination. Right? This is offensive to the sensibilities of the founding fathers. This is a repudiation of the rights that are imbued in every human being and every citizen of the United States, that are imbued in them by virtue of a clear reading of not just the Constitution, but the Bill of Rights, and so on and so forth. Well, that was the reason we implemented the Patriot Act, was because people were concerned. They were fearful of the possibility of terrorist activities. And the fear that was inspired in them by the events of 9/11 was sufficient to induce them to surrender certain of their liberties in exchange for a higher measure of security. And that's exactly what's happening here. It's the same formula. It's the same calculus. It's the more concerned we are, the more apprehensive we are. Okay, and there was a great deal of anxiety and trepidation that was endemic to France at this time, precisely because of guys like Robespierre, who were rabble rousers, and they were very good at provoking and inspiring in the people concern and fear and apprehension. And the more fearful you become, the more you're willing to surrender certain prerogatives to the state to look after the collective interests of the security of all people. And the more the state has the prerogative to ensure the national security of the state, the more it gets away with respects to arbitrarily infringing upon the rights of the common citizens, right? So it really is this back and forth, but it's a zero-sum dichotomy whereby the more rights the individual surrenders, the more personal liberties the individual surrenders, the more power the state has to therefore arbitrarily infringe upon the human rights, the inalienable human rights as we conceptualize them, of the common citizens in France or any other nation at this, well, for that matter anyways. So it seems to me to be self-evident that this is a vicious cycle. It's a cycle whereby there is a great deal of fear that is induced in the hearts and minds of the citizens by people like Robespierre who sit in the Public Safety Committee, and that fear translates into very tangible legislation which gives the state more power, but it gives the power to the state unprecedentedly. It gives disproportionate power to the members of the Public Safety Committee, such as Robespierre, to take very dramatic, very draconian, very severe measures in furtherance of protecting the interests of the state and ensuring that there are no conspiracies against the people and against the new government and anything involving the monarchists and et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what leads to this reign of terror, and that's what leads to massive executions. It was estimated that anywhere between 15,000 and 40,000 people during this 3-year period from 1791 to 1794, anywhere between 15 and 40,000 people were not just executed, but they were guillotined. They had their heads cut off. Imagine that. Imagine all the heads rolling around on the ground and on the floor and on the streets of Paris at this time in France. Absolutely incredible. Absolutely horrifying to my mind, right? 15 to 40,000 people, mass execution. Now that seems to me to be somewhat analogous to a genocide, right? It's a genocide of your own people. Now it's not a genocide on the basis of race or ethnic origin or religion necessarily or skin color. It's a genocide based on ideological preferences. It's a genocide based on, well, even worse than that, based on a mere insinuation or an imputation that you may be associated with some kind of conspiracy. Whether or not we can actually prove it is immaterial, okay? It is inconsequential. And that's the most depraved thing about all of this, right? So in a way, I think the argument must be that even though the aspirations of the French revolutionaries may have been noble, they may have wanted to implement a system which gave greater consideration to the common interests of the common man, that protected the basic liberties of that common man from arbitrary infringement from the nobles and the aristocrats and the church and the clergy and the monarchy above all. But eventually what ended up happening is that the people who were most responsible for instrumentalizing and operationalizing and actually effectuating the revolution were those who were also the most inclined to try to enhance their own power to the detriment of the common interests of that revolution, such as Robespierre, right? Such as the other members of the Committee of Public Safety, right? And they must have known that they were in many ways debasing the ideals which they ostensibly sought to represent. They must have known that because they saw that people were just having their heads cut off without due process of law, right? Just going out there and making the accusation against a person that this person may conceivably be conspiring to collaborate with monarchists or clergy or foreign nationals against the interests of the state, that was enough. That was enough to bring you in before a judge and a jury and to get an indictment and to get a conviction and to have you be sentenced to execution by way of guillotine. Now, that is absolutely terrifying, okay? That is not a nation that is being ruled by the rule of law, right? That is a nation that is in many ways, as I said, literally as well as metaphorically, being ruled by mob rule, okay? And that's the worst form of rule because the mob is very fickle, the mob is very precarious, the mob is very whimsical, and most importantly, the mob is susceptible to the influences of very brilliant orators such as Robespierre himself. And so the mob is essentially an instrument by which demagogues can implement their will and whatever invidious desires they have without consequence. So another facet of all this is that because the revolution in many ways was not just a revolution against the church, well, against the monarchy, but it was also a revolution against the church. And what ends up happening is that there's a desire to essentially liberate the people from the church, because there was this belief, and I think it was pretty, if you actually delve into it, it's a well-founded belief if you actually look into it further. There's this belief that the monarchy, which is the sum of all evils, right, which is the greatest of all evils as far as being antithetical to the interests of the common people, but the monarchy couldn't have done what it did but for the fact that the church enabled it. Okay, and so you have to say that the church had a very, very prominent part to play with respects to the capacity of the kings over the course of many generations throughout the history of France, the capacity of the kings to induce and persuade the people that they actually were anointed by God and confirmed by the church, and therefore they had not just temporal authority pursuant to their right as the head of state, but also, more importantly, they had moral authority. And so I guess you could say that if you construed the monarchy and the church as one giant conspiracy to delude the people, to deceive the people into believing that the monarch actually was anointed by God, that he was beholden only to God, and that his power and his authority and his right to rule over the people derived from the blessing, the ordination by Christ himself. If you perceive that as farcical, as just a complete misrepresentation, as merely self-serving, as dubious, as not having any veracity whatsoever, then you have to assert that this is essentially a giant conspiracy, and the Catholic Church was an enabler of this conspiracy. It was a co-conspirator in that it enabled, it empowered, and it allowed for, it permitted the monarchy to get away with all the depredations that it did, that eventually it was imputed to have done, been responsible for. Had it not been for the Catholic Church imputing this moral authority to the monarchy and saying that disobedience of the king's law and disobedience or an affront to the king is an affront to God, and so therefore you're not just offending against the laws of France, but you're offending against God himself. And so for hundreds of years, right, the church sanctioned and sanctified, legitimated, lended moral credibility and moral veracity to the rule of the king. And in so doing, it made it a sin to raise a hand up against the monarchy, to take a stand against the authority that the king had. And I think that people are finally coming to the realization that this notion, this hypothesis of divine right to rule, the divine right of kings, as it was known, right, which traces its origins, its etymology, really all the way back to Genesis, the Old Testament, the very first chapters of the Old Testament. They're saying that this is just a one giant conspiracy which is perpetrated against the common people of France and the rest of Europe in interest of ensuring that the monarch can rule in an absolute and unfettered manner, so that he's unrestricted and unrestrained and can go about arbitrarily doing whatever the hell he feels like. Because if the people believe that Christ and God is on his side, well, if God be with us, then who can be against us, right? As the phrase goes. You see this phrase echoing throughout the history of mostly the 20th century, but even before then. Gott mit uns, the phrase on the belt buckle of every soldier of the Waffen-SS, God is with us. Deus vindice, which was the motto of the Confederacy. God is on our side. Right, and so I think that if you believe that, just that you believe it, right, but that you are able to convince the common people that God is on your side, that God supports the monarch, then there's nothing that the monarch can't do. Okay, which actually, interestingly enough, this actually segues into the next conversation I want to have with you guys, which is a conversation about what is being done about the church. So there's a whole-scale repudiation of the Catholic Church, and that has very significant societal implications. In fact, I think it was Voltaire who actually said that if the church did not exist, if God did not exist, then we would have to invent him. Okay, if God did not exist, we would have to invent him. In fact, it was Dostoyevsky. If you guys read, I don't know if you read philosophical novels, but Fyodor Dostoyevsky is a Russian novelist and an author of a great many novels, great many philosophical works, and one of his books was called The Brothers Karamazov. And in that book, there's this quote by this guy named, what was his name? Smerdyakov. And he says that without God, all things can be permitted, okay? Or without religion, all things can be permitted. Which is to say that the only thing that actually constrains us from indulging in our most base fantasies, the only thing that actually inhibits humanity from devolving into depraved acts of inhumanity, is the belief that we are held accountable to a moral standard, and that there is a divine superintender whose omniscience and whose omnipotence is capable of not just being aware of that which we are doing, but also holding us accountable for the ramifications of our actions. And so the actions have consequences, if not in this life, certainly in the next. And the idea is that if we repudiate the Catholic Church, we repudiate it for, let's say, in the context of the French Revolution, the repudiation is based on very pragmatic considerations, because the Catholic Church, after all, was the enabler of the monarch. right? And the monarch is the apotheosis of all the things that are antithetical to the interests of the common people, because he represents profligacy and promiscuity and the desire to inflict all manner of suffering upon the people in a whimsical fashion. And this is just absolutely intolerable. But he couldn't have done all those things that he did, or his ancestors and his predecessors could not have done all the things that they had done over the course of the years, but for the fact that the Catholic Church was able to bamboozle the people into believing that the monarch had this moral authority, when in actuality he actually had none. So it was a giant, as I said, it was a giant act of deception, and the Catholic Church was just as complicit in this act as was the monarch himself or his self. Now, what is the implication here? Well, if we renounce the Catholic Church, we have to very quickly, very soon thereafter, the National Assembly and the people who were responsible for administering this process came to the realization that there has to be something else. There has to be something in the place of the Catholic Church, because you can't just have had an institution that existed for hundreds of years and was the sole moral arbiter of that which is good and that which is wrong, and then completely nullify it and completely annihilate its influence entirely in your culture and in your society, and not expect people to degenerate into all manner of base activities. You have to have something that comes in there as a substitute, which stands in its place. And so what ends up happening is that the French revolutionaries end up creating something known as the cult of reason. The cult of reason. And churches were converted into places where people would go and they would meditate upon the great achievements of the Enlightenment and the printing press and science and biology and chemistry and astronomy. And that people would contemplate that, and they would be in awe of all those things, and that would, in many ways, I suppose, and I don't know if this is the theory, but it's a theory, that in many ways, ruminating about all those great achievements, mostly as a consequence of the European Enlightenment, that would in many ways cause people to recognize that there is something intrinsically good, intrinsically inspirational, intrinsically worthy and valuable in humanity, because we couldn't have achieved all these magnificent feats but for the fact that there is intrinsic value in each and every one of us. And so if you recognize that there is intrinsic value in humanity, then I think it therefore follows that you're not going to go out there and just arbitrarily start murdering people just because you feel as though you can get away with it because you don't think there's a heaven anymore. Right? And so in certain ways, this cult of reason, which is essentially worshiping the achievements of science. If you guys have ever seen, there was a South Park episode out there, I think it was about from maybe 10 years ago, where they actually literally worship science, right? It was like, hail science and all praise be to science and this, that, and the other thing. And that was actually, in many ways, very reminiscent to my mind of what was happening in France at this time, right? I don't know if they were saying hail science or praying to science necessarily, because science is just sort of an idea in the abstract. It's not something like God. I don't think science cares whether or not you propitiate it, right? But I think it's fair to say that, to an extent, if you do ruminate and reflect upon the achievements of mankind, the achievements of Western civilization, indeed, the achievements of France, you can say that there is something valuable in humanity. But I think that that's a rather spurious argument, because it cuts both ways. In fact, I think it actually cuts more substantially in the other direction, which is to say that if you really want to reflect upon the nature of humanity, okay, which is really what philosophy is all about. So they're trying to come in and they're trying to say, the French Revolution is trying to say that we don't need church anymore. We don't need Catholicism. We don't need God, in fact. We don't need the belief in God anymore, because we have this thing called the cult of reason, right? And the cult of reason asserts that if you reflect deeply enough, if you ruminate substantially enough and for long enough on the great achievements of humanity, the magnificence of civilization, and all the sorts of things that derive from the human mind, and all the sorts of great things that we, over the course of the last couple of hundred years in enlightened Europe, have achieved, well, then you can't help but feel some intrinsic value that is innate, that is indistinguishable or inexorably associated with every human being. Now, I think that's a spurious argument, and the reason why I say that is because the Enlightenment wasn't a product of the collective endeavoring of all humanity. There were certain individuals who were disproportionately influential in terms of achieving the scientific feats that were necessary in driving the Enlightenment forward. And so you can't say that the Enlightenment is representative of all individuals collectively who happen to be human beings. nor can you necessarily say that we ought only and exclusively focus on all these great and magnificent and magisterial achievements of science and reason and logic and philosophy and all these other disciplines, and merely ruminate about that, when completely discounting and completely nullifying all the negative connotations that humanity necessarily brings with it. I mean, think about all the depredations that just transpired in the course of the French Revolution itself, right? Think about all the heads that are rolling around out there on the, the anadismo of Paris, right? The various districts in the city of Paris, right? Think about all the terrible violence that was done, that many of these people felt was necessary to instrumentalize, to actually effectuate the French Revolution. You can't completely negate that. You can't discount that. That is just as much a part of humanity as is the impulse and the inclination to go out there and to learn and to immerse yourself in edifying works that may instruct you and may cause you to be a more edified and philosophical individual. You can't necessarily, they are two parts of the same being. And so this notion that you can do without God and you can do without religion, in many ways, seems to me to essentially say that you can only do that if you are in many ways intellectually dishonest in your understanding of the nature of human nature, right? What is it? What is humanity? What is the nature of humanity? Well, humanity is, in many ways, it has sort of a duality to it, right? There's the good part of humanity and there's the bad part of humanity, but you can't just exclusively look at the good any more than you can exclusively look at the bad, right? And so I think that this cult of reason was doomed to fail by virtue of the fact that people, just by virtue of their own experiences, understand implicitly that human nature is not merely good. It's not always good all the time. In fact, quite to the contrary, oftentimes it's bad, unless there is some sort of higher moral authority which constrains you, which impedes you from acting out in your own self-interest. And the only reason you're going to be impeded is because you believe that there's a higher form of moral accountability which transcends your life in this world. Now, obviously, this is a very difficult argument for an atheist to make, but that's the whole reason why I'm making it. I try to make arguments which, in my mind, are completely antithetical to my own rational understanding of the world, and that makes it more difficult for me to make. But I like the challenging arguments because they force us to actually work more hard to actually make them. So, now, how did this all end? Well, it ended up with, as is a quote from, I think, the Bible, actually. Then Christ said this: "Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." Right? Now, Robespierre didn't necessarily live by the sword because he wasn't out there personally cutting people's heads off, jihad style, but he had other people do his dirty work for him and at his behest in furtherance of his own ideological purposes. And believe it or not, Robespierre himself fell victim to the violence of this time, and he was actually tried, and he was convicted, and he was sentenced to death, really as a result of having essentially made too many enemies. Okay. And the people realize that this guy is essentially a very psychopathic individual, that he's going out there and pursuing this for his own purposes, to amass more power unto himself, and that is a selfish reason that is completely incongruous with the precepts of the French Revolution. Because if you go back and you remember the motto, the original motto, which inspired revolutionary sentiments, it was liberté, égalité, and well, something else. Okay, liberty, egalitarianism, and I think freedom. Okay. Well, anyways, it was the idea that we should go out there and we should invest ourselves in noble undertakings that are not just noble for their own sake, but noble because they advance the interests of the common people. And doing the sorts of things that Robespierre was doing was in many ways completely removed from that. Okay. I don't have anything more to say about this. So that's all we're going to say. Let's move on to this book. And there's a couple of things that I want to bring to your guys' attention. Now, I'm not saying, as I said before, I don't think you have to read this. If you want to enhance your understanding of what this guy's talking about, by all means do so. And if when I'm done with what I'm going to do here, you still don't really fully appreciate the arguments that he's making, then by all means read it. It's only going to take you an hour. And what I'm referring to here is the introduction. It's 20 pages in all. It took me about an hour, so I don't think it'll take you guys much more. So one of the things that he talks about is he's comparing and contrasting the success of the West in relation to the success of the rest, as he refers to them as. And what he does before that actually what he's doing incidental to that argument is he's trying to look at various metrics, various ways in which we can actually evaluate the achievements of Western civilization when juxtaposed with the failings, if you will, of the shortcomings, shall I say, of other civilizations, right? And one of the things that he does is, and I think this is interesting, and the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because I want to demonstrate that just because an argument is being made by this author in this book doesn't necessarily mean that it's beyond the possibility of refutation, right? That it's just so impervious to any sort of logical assault. Because one of the things that he says, he's looking at life expectancy, okay? And the quote, the passage that I have highlighted in this book, and I'm going to read this to you. He says, average life expectancy in England was nearly twice what it was in India. And this was in 1913, okay? Higher living standards in the West were also reflected in a better diet, even for agricultural laborers, and taller stature, even for ordinary soldiers and convicts. Now, why would I focus in on that particular passage? What is the assumption that he's making there with respect to what he's saying here? Well, it seems to me that what he's saying here is that the idea of life expectancy and being of taller stature, even for ordinary soldiers and convicts, what he's presupposing is that, I think what he's presupposing here is that ordinary soldiers and convicts ought to be shorter and they ought to die much sooner than people in the common demographic. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a good or a logical or a empirically based conclusion, right? Because life expectancy, and particularly your height, how tall you are, doesn't really have to do with what you're doing in terms of your daily activities. It has to do with your genetics, right? I mean, I happen to have tall parents, so I'm 6'3", right? If you know anybody who's a very short person, right, they have dwarfism, right? Generally, they have dwarfism because their parents had dwarfism, okay? And it's passed on. It's a hereditary condition. So I don't think that that's necessarily a very persuasive argument, right? Now, what I'm not going to do here is I'm not going to nitpick at various passages in this book and say that I don't believe in this because X, Y, and Z, because that would be, to my mind, a bit disingenuous. So what I am going to do, though, is I'm going to try to focus in on some of the more important arguments that he makes, and let's examine these and let's see whether or not we can actually test them and see whether or not they're logical, whether or not they're consistent with the history as we understand it, and whether or not there's perhaps competing explanations that can supersede whatever it is he's advocating for. So I guess that's what I aspire to do. So moving on. One of the points that he makes here is he says that Western civilization is not necessarily great because of the Enlightenment achievements, and it's not great because the Western part of Europe was predisposed ecologically and environmentally and geographically to achieve great and wondrous things. That's the other argument. Remember, there's competing hypotheses here, right? There's competing postulations. This guy is not saying that, okay? That was Jared Diamond. There was this other guy, he gave that speech, and I had you guys read excerpts from that speech back in 1999. It was the guy who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. Now that guy is saying that Europe achieved ascendancy, it achieved its supremacy in relation to the rest of the world by virtue of the fact that it was all the things that happened in Europe only happened because they happened geographically in that particular area, right? He's making the argument that this is innate, this is endemic to Europe, the achievements, the Enlightenment, all the success that Europe has had. This guy's making a slightly more nuanced argument. What he's saying is that it just so happened that he's talking about the political ideologies that came into fruition in Europe, mostly during the 20th century, right? So we're fast forwarding here, we're going through the ages and we're going up to the 20th century, okay? And he's talking about the ideological ways of structuring one's government that resulted from European philosophical understandings. And he goes on to say, well, there were three basic types of ideological ways, mechanisms, with which one could use to actually govern the state. He says there was democracy, there was fascism, and there was communism. Okay, and he's not saying that they're equals. He's just saying that if you look at history subsequent to, let's say, the mid 20th century, you will see that, or the early 20th century, because fascism came about in the very early 20th century. But if you look at the rest of the world at this time, early mid 20th century, these ideas were exported to other places around the world. And they were exported to these other places around the world because they actually worked, because they were successful in serving as a means by which to govern various states. And so he's saying that the ideas that took root, that had root in Europe, had greater efficacy in terms of their capacity to govern a people, to serve as a governing template for other nations. And that is the reason as to why they were exported. And that is the reason as to why, at least intellectually, in the context of ideologies, in terms of the ways in which people decide to govern and rule themselves, that is one particular aspect of Western supremacy. So it's a supremacy of ideas, is what he's saying. Okay, the ideas that were given rise to by the Enlightenment process in the context of Europe, those ideas were so tractable, were so resilient, and were so effective and efficient that they were exported to all around the rest of the world. And other nations embraced those ideas that were Western in origin. And those nations began to become, in many ways, sort of a simulacrum of the West, right? Because they took on the trappings of the West, because they were reproducing their ideas, and they were governing in accordance with philosophical notions that were produced in the context of Europe. Okay, so I think he's saying not just that. Well, he's repudiating the old argument, because the original argument historically, if you go back and you look at the historiography of this particular period, most emphasis is placed on empire, right? This idea that European powers were successful because they were able to go out there and exploit natural resources in places like Africa, and places like Asia and India, etc. And by virtue of the exploitation of the resources, be they natural or human resources, right? Because they exploited the humans as well, right? That gave them an unprecedented strategic advantage, geopolitically speaking, over the rest of the world. Well, this guy's saying, no, hold on, it's not that, right? Or it's not only that, I should say, right? It's not merely by virtue of colonization and imperial aspirations, which the powers of Europe actually had and were able to consummate. That's not merely the reason as to why they were successful. It's also about the ideas, because ideas are much more tractable. Ideas resonate. Ideas are much more resilient, and ideas can transcend geographic boundaries much more so than physical weapons and infrastructure and material things, right? And I think that that's part of what he's saying. What else does he say? He goes on to say how if you look at economic systems, right? And this is sort of an extension of ideology, right? Ideology is just it's a form of philosophy. Ideology is just the way in which you conceptualize how to rule yourselves, right? Ideology is just a set of ideas in this particular context. You can have a different definition of ideology if you want, right? But ideology, the kind of ideology we're talking about, is a set of ideas as it relates to thinking about the best ways to go about implementing a system of government whereby you can maximize the efficiency of that government in the best interest of the people, right? It's a way of trying to improve upon your own self-rule, how to achieve a better way of understanding how to rule yourselves, right? That's what ideology is, or that's what it's instrumental in achieving. Okay. Now he goes on and he extends this, and he says, well, it's not just ideology that came out of Europe, but it's also economic philosophy or economic principles, right? If you look at the great economists and you look at economic theory, right, where does it begin? I've got a brilliant friend of mine. His name is well, I probably shouldn't say his name because this is YouTube, and I don't know if any of you guys are gonna go track him down or anything. But his first name is John, and he studied economy. He studied economics and politics and philosophy in Oxford, actually, which is a university in England. And one of the things that he likes to talk about is The Wealth of Nations. And The Wealth of Nations is a book that was written around probably the 17th century, and it was written by a guy by the name of Adam Smith. Okay, now Adam Smith and his book and the theories that are inherent to that book, the economic theories which he advocates for, became the premise or sort of the predicate for capitalism. You don't get capitalism unless you get the ideas, the ruminations of Adam Smith. And of course, there's this other guy, John Maynard Keynes, who comes along, and he's got a little bit of a variation on what it is that Adam Smith is advocating for. And he's suggesting, well, there needs to be more government regulation in relation to the economy, and that needs to guide the market as opposed to just what's in demand in terms of what people are actually buying. But the fact of the matter is that these economic theories originated from Europe, from Europeans who themselves were a product of the European Enlightenment, right? So again, we're continuing this theme of ideas that are being exported, and they're not being exported with force, right? It's not like we Europeans are going to come to India and we're going to enforce upon all of you guys capitalism because you must embrace capitalism, because if you don't, we're going to pull the trigger and blow your head off. It's not that. No, it's the reason these ideas gain traction was precisely because they are so efficient, because they are so expedient, because they are so successful. When you actually apply them, again, to use the author's word, as a template for governing your state or for establishing the economic model that you're going to use, right? And that's why these ideas proliferated around the world, because they were just they made sense. They were very pragmatic. Okay, they were expedient. Now, of course, the other idea that was exported from Europe at this time was communism, right? Now, is communism a political ideology, or is communism something more comprehensive and holistic? I would argue that communism is, in fact, a total solution, essentially, right? It's a total solution. It is a complete answer to all the world's problems. And for that reason, it's doomed to failure, right? And any proposition that asserts itself as having all the answers to all the problems is in many ways, I mean, I think going to actually be extremely unsuccessful, is going to be unproductive, is going to be non-viable, right? Because it can't possibly have all the answers, right? It's like that movie, The Theory of Everything, about the theories. I think that was the quantum theory advanced by Stephen Hawking, right? Well, there is a theory of everything as it relates to the governing dynamics of physical matter, but there's no theory of everything when it comes to sociology and political philosophy and economy. And so communism represents itself as being, as I said, a total solution. But communism gained traction. Communism resonated with the sensibilities of many people around the world. You think about the Cold War, right? For the better part of 50, 60 years, for the better part of almost 70 years, actually, the world was divided into two different ideological camps. You had the West, which were devotees of democracy and capitalism, and then you had the Soviet bloc, right, which were devotees of communism, right? And communism was not just a form of political rule and a way in which by which you can govern your state, but it was also an economic model as well, right? It was all about who controls the means of production. And this all goes back to Marxist theory. Well, Marx himself was a European, right? He was a German, actually, rather ironically so, because Germany ends up being, in many ways, the nemesis of Russia, which is the strongest and the most vociferous proponent of communism. So the theory that a German advocates for ends up giving power to the enemies of Germany, which he himself came from. But that's one of the ironies of history that we need not dwell on. So, yeah. So communism is, well. Let's talk about other things. How about this? One of the other things he says here is that the intellectual achievements of Europe are astounding in relation to the intellectual achievements of the rest of the world. Now, he's very careful to preface this by saying, or qualify this by saying, that in many ways, the people who were responsible for the European Enlightenment stood on the shoulders of giants in a way, right? Because you don't get the theories of Newton or the celestial observations of Galileo unless first you have the work of people that were living under the Ottoman Empire, and before that living under the Persian Empire, and the Egyptian astronomer Pliny, and other various illustrious individuals throughout the course of time and history. And so what he's saying is that, yes, it is true that there were other scientific achievements in the world before the Enlightenment happened in the context of Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, but the extent to which there was this profusion of ideas, and the extent to which ideas really resonated with common people, and people began to assimilate these ideas and then implement new and more efficient ways of living as a result of the Enlightenment, that really happened disproportionately in Europe at this time, okay, which I think is actually a very fair point to make. And he's saying that most modern science, almost all modern science, originates from the kind of intellectual achievements that were undertaken by men of European enlightenment. And he goes on and he lists Newton, of course, and Galileo, and he lists Einstein, and then so on and so forth. And which is just to say that modern technology and our modern world, okay, the physics that drives modern propulsion systems, the physics that enables us to understand and interact with the cosmos, mechanical theories and theories, mathematical theories, arithmetical theories, all of that really is in many ways derivative from the Enlightenment that happened in Europe. Right? Not and you can't just say that happened in a vacuum, right? And that's not what he's saying, okay? But he's saying that the Enlightenment in Europe had a disproportionately profound impact on the rest of the world, and it also guided the trajectory of not just Western civilization, but other societies that sought to emulate the success or reproduce the success of Western civilization, also try to embrace these intellectual notions that originated from Europe at this time, right? Europe and the West. And we're gonna go on and we're gonna try to define the West because he defines it a little bit differently than I define it. How about this? Well, he says this business about empire, how empire is not necessarily dispositive in determining whether or not you are going to be successful in terms of looking at where a particular place is in time and then anticipating how much more successful they're going to be 20 or 30 or 40 or 100 years from now. And why is he saying that empire is not necessarily dispositive? It's not the most important predicate to success in the context of evaluating achievement in a very holistic manner. Well, because what he does is he reflects upon empires of past, okay? And he looks at the Chinese empires, right? And then he looks at the Mughal empire of the Indian subcontinent. And then, of course, he looks at the empire of Macedonia, the empire of Alexander the Great, and, of course, the Roman Empire, certainly. And what he says is that all of those empires ended up decaying, ended up being destroyed either externally or internally, and they didn't survive, right? Well, I don't know if I completely subscribe to that proposition, because it's not just a matter of did this empire survive, but how long did this empire survive for? How resilient and robust was this empire? And if you look at the Roman Empire, depends on when you begin dating the Roman Empire. I mean, you could date it all the way back to the founding of the Republic, 753 BC. I think that's a little bit premature, but we could say, well, at least in the time of Augustus, right? So that's right around the, before the 1st century AD. So, and it didn't really, it wasn't destroyed, didn't reach its natural terminus until the middle of the 5th century AD. So that's nearly 500 years of Roman Empire, right? Nearly 500 years of Roman political and economic and military hegemony in the Western Mediterranean, and in many ways just all over Europe, from Scotland all the way down to modern day Libya or Algeria or the desert sands of Egypt, right? And so to say that empire was not successful is, I think, in some ways disingenuous to the historical record, because it's not actually admitting that empire was very resilient and very long lasting. It had a very long life, and it was able to maintain its success for a very long time by doing what it was doing. Now, I think what he's saying, though, is that Rome, much like the West in the modern example, didn't just achieve its success by virtue of going out there and conquering and subjugating people and enslaving everybody they encountered. It wasn't just that. It was partially that, because the Romans were conquerors, obviously, but it was also that if you actually sort of apply retroactively the argument that he's making to Rome, you could say that the Romans had a lot of great ideas, right? They were very innovative. They had a lot of great technologies, right? It wasn't just technology in that it enhanced and enabled them to achieve military dominance, but it was also technology that had a more civil application. You think about the aqueducts, okay? You think about the philosophy of law, right? Because in a way, I wouldn't say that's a technology, but it's a form of intellectual advancement that has a pragmatic connotation to it. It has an application which is very tangible in terms of making you a more successful society, because you are ruled by law that is logical, law that is rational, law that is equitable, and law that applies itself equally to all people, regardless of who they happen to be. Now, and I think for many reasons, you could say that is why Rome was successful for as long as it was. And then you look at these other empires and you say, well, the Chinese empire did last for a very long time. But I think he would say that the reason for that was because China was so isolated, right? China was a very insular form of empire, right? It was literally insular in that it insulated itself and clothed itself off from the rest of the world by virtue of building a wall, right? This Great Wall of China, okay? And you could say that, therefore, the sorts of considerations that are, in the author's mind anyways, important to determining the longevity and the vibrance and the vitality of an empire weren't really applicable to China, because China is a different case in and of itself. So what we have to say there is that just because China lasted a very long time is not an effective rebuttal to the author's argument, right? Because the reason China lasted a very long time has nothing to do with the fact that China didn't necessarily do the sorts of things that the author is recommending they did. The reason it lasted a long time was because they literally isolated themselves from the rest of the world. Okay, they closed themselves off from the rest of the world. So I think that you can't say that China is a refutation of the author's thesis in this respect, right? Now, if China was an open society and China was engaging in trade and China was going over there and conquering other people, enslaving them, and doing what Rome did and doing what all the other European empires did, well, then you could say that you could apply this analysis to China, and then China sort of is not really a it's not a particularly good example. But I think it's interesting to note that China is independent of this analysis precisely because China is in many ways so different geographically than Europe, and it is different also geopolitically because it was so isolated, and it sought to isolate itself deliberately, whereas Europe sought to actually expand and explore and to go out there and colonize and to exploit the resources of other people and to engage in wars with other people and do all the sorts of things that led to the process of civilization, which the author is talking about. Okay, what else does he say? Well, this is just an argument against the proposition that empire is in and of itself necessary to achieve success. He's saying no, it's not, right? It's not just about empire. It's partly about empire, but it has more to do with ideas. Okay? All right, now I'll turn to the page here. So he's talking about how scientific technology is in many ways distributed evenly across the world up until about well, he says 1759. I don't know why he gets that exact date, but I suspect he's probably going to elucidate that more later on. But what he says here is that he says that there's sort of technology and innovation and learning and enlightenment principles are sort of diffuse, right? They're spread out all across the world up until about the middle of the 18th century. Okay, now then he says, but what happened, right? He's saying something must have happened in the 1600s, in the late to mid 1600s, whereby there was a change, right? Because what he's saying is that there was this kind of homeostasis whereby all the various places around the world, whether it was Asia, whether it was well, not so much Africa, but Asia and the Middle East, and particularly in India, especially, and indeed Europe to a certain extent, right? They all achieved a comparable level of enlightenment with respect to their understanding of the natural world around them, okay? And then something happened in Europe in the 1600s, the late 1600s, the early 1700s, whereby the processes that were being used to explore and understand the world around them, those processes were greatly accelerated, which led to a higher level of understanding and much more quickly when juxtaposed with those same processes in the rest of the world. And that's a question which he poses. And he says this guy, David Landes, he's another historian, and he's a sort of an economic historian. He's competing in terms of his ideas. He said David Landes made the cultural case by arguing that Western Europe led the world in developing autonomous intellectual inquiry, the scientific method of verification, and the rationalization of research and its diffusion. Yet he allowed that something more was required for that mode of operation to flourish: financial intermediaries and good government. The key, it becomes ever more apparent, lies with institutions. So what the author is saying is he's basically saying that you can't necessarily have enlightenment that is highly successful unless you have a means by which to deploy it, a means by which to actually make it tractable, and a means by which to export it as well. Okay, so it's not just that Europe was more civilized in the sense that they were more enlightened and they were more edified because they had more information, because they had a better understanding of the world around them, right? But it was also that there was something else that was happening. There was these institutions, okay, that you had good governance, that you had the rule of law, that you had other systems that were intrinsic to Europe, that were innate to Europe, that these other places didn't necessarily have. Right? So it wasn't just about let's go out there and explore the world, right? Whether it's through astronomy, whether it's through physics, whether it's through medicine, whether it's through philosophy, right? Because all these other places around the world had these different disciplines. They had these different ways of understanding and interpreting information and trying to enhance human understanding, and then obviously apply the knowledge that they gleaned through these enlightenment endeavors in a way that made their life more easy, right? It wasn't that in and of itself wasn't enough. It was also in conjunction with institutions which were originated in Europe. And these institutions were unique to Europe, and that, therefore, coupled with Enlightenment, that's what gave rise to European ascendancy, or indeed supremacy, in relation to the rest of the world. So it's absolutely integral to understand what these institutions were. And then he goes on to say, well, then he talks about Jared Diamond, this guy who you read this article from. He says that just saying that Europe was predisposed geographically or ecologically or biologically predisposed to be successful is not enough, okay? Because there were other places that kind of were like Europe that had other geographic conditions that were similar to Europe, right? But yet they didn't proliferate to the extent that Europe proliferated. So there's something else. There's sort of a surplus value, and that's what he's getting at. And he says, the problem with this guy Jared Diamond's argument is that it presupposes that competition is a good thing, right? That competition is always a good thing, right? That it's unequivocally, it's always a good thing, right? Well, he says that that's not necessarily the case, because remember, going back to what this guy Jared Diamond was arguing, and I made the case for him way back when, a couple of weeks ago, when I was still with you guys in the classroom. And Jared Diamond was the guy who came along and said, basically, the reason Western Europe is successful is because you got a lot of little countries that have different ways of interpreting the world, that have different philosophies, that have different forms of governance, that have different technologies, and they're all living very close together. And because they're living close together, there's a lot of competition, and they're fighting each other. And by virtue of fighting each other, they have to innovate, right? Because necessity is the mother of all invention, right? And there's nothing more necessary than going out there and devising new ways to kill your enemy. And he's saying that by virtue of that, by virtue of going out there and having these wars in Europe amongst the Europeans, that was a driving force which compelled innovation in Europe. And it didn't happen in a place that was this sort of monolithic unitary form of government like China, because China didn't have these divisions in it, right? And so therefore it was in many ways anathema to the kinds of developments that happened in Europe by virtue of Europe being a geopolitically heterogeneous place with a lot of different countries, with a lot of different principles and philosophies, and a lot of different governments that were fighting each other all the time. And then Niall says, well, it's not just all good all around all the time, because think about the catastrophic human consequences that flowed from all these wars in Europe. You think about the wars, the 100 Years' War between France and England. You think about all the religious wars after the Protestant Reformation, and how those wars were in many ways a tremendous setback because they devastated Europe economically, right? And they inflicted all manner of casualties, and Europe suffered inestimably as a consequence of those wars. So it's not just, and war is an extension of a competition, right? War, I think Jared Diamond would argue, is the ultimate form of competition. But it can't just be about war, therefore, because war in many ways is antithetical to the sorts of civilizational processes which are necessary to advancing people and humanity and Enlightenment principles. And so you can't say that war in and of itself, or competition rather in and of itself, is a good thing, because it necessarily leads to war, and war undermines the kinds of things that are actually facilitative of the development of civilization. That's the argument against the hypothesis that Jared Diamond, this guns, germs, and steel guy, is advocating for. So be able to understand that. And then he goes on to talk about, actually I can't go on to talk about this stuff because I'm running out of time here, guys. And I know you guys are tired of hearing me with these redundant apologies. And I really do genuinely mean to make a very concerted effort next time to reduce this and to consolidate this down to maybe an hour, and probably maybe just an hour actually, because I actually owe you guys back pay, as it were, because I've taken up so much of your time over the course of these last videos without giving any consideration for the fact that ordinarily we have a break. So you guys have sort of like the cumulative value of 4 or 5 breaks now added up that I owe to you, and so that we got to take that out of the next lecture video and discount that from the time overall that I would otherwise take, which is to say that that's, I don't know, let's call it 40 minutes, right? So next time, I'm only going to spend an hour, and I promise you that. I know you've heard that before, and I know you're getting tired of me and my false promises, but I'm going to end this now because we're up to an hour and 53 minutes, guys. As always, let me know if I'm not doing a good enough job. Let me know if you got any concerns, any criticisms, any critiques, anything you want me to know whatsoever. I am completely amenable to listening to what you have to say and totally down for implementing whatever suggestions you might have. Hope you guys are staying safe. Hope you guys are having a good week, and I'll be talking to you soon enough.